Welcome to the American Tradition. My name is Jeremy Mack. I'm a pastor, I'm a farmer, I'm a localist, and I'm an essayist. And today we're going to drop our video topic Tuesday. We're going to do a little bit on Marxism versus capitalism over the next few weeks. I wanted to start out with Marxism and why Marxism never works and why it always ends in coercion and violent actions taken by governments. So let's start out. Let's start out by talking about the Soviet Union. So I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union. I was 17 or 18, I believe, when the wall fell in East Berlin and Eastern Germany and Western Germany were reunited, and the Soviet Union sort of fell apart. Now, it was an unforeseen event. A lot of people act like people saw it coming, but it's not really true. No one really saw it coming. No one was really aware at how close the Soviet Union was to falling apart. So after the Soviet Union fell apart, then we got to look at what really happened inside the Soviet Union. And so one of the things that you learn about in the Soviet Union is that once the Bolshevik Revolution had started in 1917 and had come to its completion, excuse me today, the idea was that they would take all their trades and all their businesses and all their industries, and they basically formed trade guilds. And what happened is that the government controlled all trade and trade guilds in the Soviet Union. And so let's use farming as a way to explain how this happened, or what it means to be controlled by the state and what it means to have a guild. So, like all other places in the world, the Soviet Union was made up, or previous when it was Russia, so previous to the Soviet Union, property was privately held there. So there were farms, some large, some small. And so what happened was, in a communist or communal system, they confiscated all private property. So they confiscated all title to property. So no one held title to property anymore, and they put everything into one large title. So the state owned and controlled it. So there were no more individual farms. They were then large industrial agricultural centers. And if you were in the farming trade, then you joined the farming trade guild. You were part of that guild or trade union. So what was a union or a guild? It's basically the same thing. And you worked in a farm in your local area where you lived, and you went there and you farmed just like before, okay, except for you didn't own the property. You were not a property owner. You were just one of many. And this sounds like a good idea. Sounds like it's going to work. So, but it's very utopian. That's one of the things about Marxism in general, is it's utopian. It is it's a best case scenario system. But the issue is that things don't most never work out to best case scenarios. So let's talk about what happened there. Okay, let's say everyone is equal and everyone has equal ownership in this farm. But the truth about the matter is not everyone is equal. Not everyone is equal in work capacity. Not everyone is equal in work ethic. Not everyone is equal in efficiency in farming, etc. So let's use three individual people. So let's say there's a guy who works 8 hours a day, and he shows up and he's really good at farming. He's really good at his job, and he really works hard to make that industrial agricultural farm work. All right, so there's your one employee. And then the other employee, or the other person, comes, and maybe they work pretty hard. They work 6 hours a day. They're not as efficient, and they go behind the barn and take a nap a couple of hours of every day. And then let's say there's another person there, and they don't work even as hard as that person does. Let's say they only work for 4 hours a day, and the other 4 hours a day they spend behind the barn napping. Okay, so they all stand in line and they all get the same amount of food. Week in and week out, week in and week out, the guy who works 6 hours watches the guy who works 4 hours get the same box of food that he gets. And he already has an integrity issue because he already has a low work ethic. And then the guy who works 8 hours a day is also watching the same thing process, but he's a higher integrity person. So the 6 hour farmer watches the 4 hour farmer get paid the same box every week. And he begins to say to himself, why would I work 6 hours when I can work 4 hours and get the same box that he gets? And eventually, instead of having a 4 hour farmer, a 6 hour farmer, and an 8 hour farmer, you end up with two 4 hour farmers and an 8 hour farmer. And for a while, the man with high integrity and high work ethic continues his work just as before, but food is getting less because you've got two other less productive workers not working as hard. And that guy 2 hours a day, that was a 6 hour a day worker, has now stopped being productive for 2 hours a day. That accumulates over time. And so that lack of work accumulates over time. And the man who's working 8 hours just can't keep up. And the food that he's getting is the same amount as the two 4 hour workers. And there's less of it for everybody. So he begins to become less productive as well. Instead of going immediately and sleeping behind the barn for 4 hours, he goes to just a 6 hour work day. And then 2 hours, he's back there with the guys. And then eventually, they're all behind the barn for 4 hours a day, napping and not working. And they're all still getting the same amount of food together. But now that food is getting less and less and less because your productive workers were de-incentivized from working. So the Soviet Union then developed a problem, okay, because you've got people going hungry and it's not very productive and they don't have as much food as they used to have. So they have to come up with a solution for it. Their solution is the guys behind me right here. Their solution is to put soldiers at the farm with bayonets and bullets and to press the guys who were behind the barn for 4 hours a day back into service. So there's a threat of violence now behind them if they are not productive, okay? And so this threat of violence begins to show up in all the areas, not just in farming, in machinery, and other production, and factory, and everywhere, because the same process happened everywhere all over the Soviet Union, because you are not dealing with equal people. Equality is a unicorn. It's a myth. It doesn't really exist. People aren't equal in intelligence and work ethic. They're not equal in athletic ability. They're not equal across a whole host of things. Even if you have two people of the same intellectual capacity, IQ, right, there's still going to be vast differences in their emotional makeup, in their ability to handle stress, in their integrity as a person. I mean, you can have a genius who's a terrible person, right? And you can have a genius who's a wonderful person. And then there's all those ranges in between. And so you don't have equality. And it's this problem that starts to erupt all over the place as they're treating people equally, but they're not equal. And the more they treat everyone equally, the more everything is pulled down to the lowest common denominator. And more everything is pulled down to the lowest common denominator, the more they need a threat of violence behind everybody as a motivator. But as you might figure out, a threat of violence really only works for a period of time. Fear is not as productive a motivator either. And so even with a threat of violence, they were far less productive, even in a serf system. So imagine that you think serfs were treated bad in the Soviet Union in Tsarist Russia. And I'm not in any way claiming that they were. But what I am saying is that as long as private property existed, even in some areas, among some people, so it may not have been universal private property, property owners were in the royal family or in the oligarchic class or whatever, but even then, the Soviet Union was more productive under serfdom than it was under universal ownership. And that is the basic story of the Soviet Union all over the place. But you can also transcend it into all other nations that go on and practice this sort of thing. It always pulls down to the lowest common denominator. It doesn't push up to the highest common denominator. It pulls everything down. It eventually has to have a threat of force behind it. But that threat of force is not a suitable motivator to maintain solidarity as a community, as a nation, as a productive entity. And so it always collapses in on itself because of it. That's a basic story of Marxism and why Marxism never works, because to each according to his need sounds like a wonderful maxim, that's the maxim of Marxism. I mean, remember, you have scales of Marxism too. You know, you have full-blown communism, which we saw in the Soviet Union, but then you have also other forms of Marxism, like a national socialist unions, like the Nazis. That's what Nazi was, National Socialists, where the state controls the means of production. But wherever the state enters to control the means of production, you have this pulling down of the work ethic to the lowest common denominator. You always end up with a coercive threat of force needed behind it, which is followed eventually by a collapse, because fear is not a sufficient motivator. Violence is coercive, but it is not sufficient to hold a society together. All right, let's talk about how Soviet Union solved this problem, farming. Go back to farming, and then really quickly, I'll close. So they're starving now because they don't have enough food, because they're lacking really productive capacity. And so what they do is they give people private gardens for them to garden. They allow people to begin to have a private garden back at their house. So what they do is they essentially just recognize some form of private property again around their home property. And those people begin to work 4 hours a day at the farm. They were, you know, with a threat of violence in their back, they were there for 8 hours a day, but they would come home and work doubly hard on their own garden, because the fruit of their hands was what they received. They were going to get whatever level of productive capacity they put into their garden. They were going to get it back, and they were guaranteed to get it back because it was theirs. And so they solved their hunger problem by instituting private property in a small form back in the Soviet Union, which really just served to whet the appetites of the Soviet people again, the Russian people again, we should call them now the Russian people again, for some level of private property. And so that's how they solved their hunger problem, but it also led to the collapse of the Soviet Union as people began to see more and more, just through practical experience, that the way to solve the issues in the Soviet Union is going to be through private property. So that's why Marxism never works. That's why it always ends in coercion. That's why fear is not a good motivator for solidarity in a community or a nation. So why it always collapses. And then that's also how, when these nations collapse, they also rebuild. When they rebuild, they build under a regime of private property. So that's how you go from being a capitalist to a Marxist to being a capitalist again, or some form of capitalism again. Anyway, hope you enjoy this video. We're going to talk a little bit next week about capitalism in general. We're going to talk through what we need to do in order to have a capitalist society, and how a capitalist society leads to, in every way, the exact opposite of what we saw happen in the Soviet Union, and in fact, all over the world, wherever Marxism is tried. Thanks a lot. Remember to like the page. Remember to subscribe over on YouTube. Subscribe to our website. Make sure to check out our political platform we've recently put together, and look to get behind some of these things locally, some of those platform issues locally, as we try to renew, reform, and restore the American traditions again in our local communities, as a means of resistance against the globalizing and Marxist factors that we see at work in Western nations today. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.